Sash or casement windows, where a rectangular window is divided into two sections, one of which slides in front of the other to allow people in the room to open the top or the bottom of the window, or a little bit of both, were really common at the end of the 1800s and through most of the 1900s. They're particularly common in household, domestic architecture. And they have some really interesting characteristics, which sadly are often not fully captured in our drawings. Drawings such as this window here often end up looking more like this. Usually, of course, the scale of drawing an individual window is a lot smaller. And while this is obviously a window, it doesn't capture the perspective details and also the details of casement windows in particular. So what would be better? Well, firstly, just with the simple perspective, there is an inset here in the window, which is good to get. Applying some tone makes it a little more obvious. Then there's a strip of wooden beading that goes around the outside. We have our upper sash window. And because of the perspective, we see more of the window surrounds on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. One interesting thing with sash windows is they often have this decorative finish on the top window. And if it's there, it's good to include it. And then we actually see some of the inside edge of this. And then we also see the underside edge of the lower half of the upper sash window. And then we see something of the thickness. The sun's catching the little swivel catch used to lock the top window in place. As is often the case, there is actually a shadow cast on the window. So this captures a little more of the detail and the interest in our sash window. But we can see another helpful characteristic of sash windows in this example. And now we have the start of the woodwork. What we want to try and do is capture as much of the construction as possible. And we want to allow for the fact that the windows are three-dimensional and that all these little strips of wood have got depth. So here we have the top section of the casement windows drawn, but it's the lower half that particularly is of interest. What I'm talking about isn't really apparent until we put some shading on. And what happens is that the upper part catches the light differently to the lower part. And the main point here is the way the shadows catch differently on one side of the casement window, because the upper section of this sliding window is set in front of the back section, and this impacts the shadows. And depending how dark we do the shadows, it can actually end up looking as if the upper window is wider than the lower window. Now, of course, the windows seen directly from the front are just as wide top and bottom, but it's because the upper one is set forward so it can slide in front of the lower one that the shadows create this different effect. And depending where the sun is and from what perspective we're seeing the windows, it creates this really interesting light effect. But if we don't allow enough three-dimensionality in our drawing, if we don't allow for the depth that the window is set back from the wall, and then also for the depth that the timber beading has, we have nowhere to put the shadows. Where would we put the shadows here? Here's another great example of a pair of casement windows with some other interesting characteristics we can capture if we observe them carefully and have some attention to detail when we draw. So let me show you. I'll just progress this drawing a little bit more. And the important thing to realize is that these vertical pane supports actually step back because they're further away from us than the ones on the upper casement windows. And of course, we can make that more obvious if we add a little tone. And so by capturing this setback, we add just a little more realism into our drawing. Of course, more often in our drawings, windows are really quite small and we don't have space for all of those elements. But we can still just try to capture the essence of the sash windows and their construction. And to capture something of the sense of the setback. And on a very small scale, it can be as simple as just making sure that our shadow behind the lower pane of glass is set back slightly from the one above. And this little clue will let our brain see a far more complete casement or sash window than we've really drawn. So as I always say, it's so much worth giving more attention in observing our windows before we draw them. And if we want to have a place to put shadows, then we need to capture the three-dimensionality of our windows being set into a wall and of the wooden structures that hold the glass. G'day, I'm Travers. If you haven't already subscribed, why not? And hit notifications so that you know when I post a new video. Look, windows are such an important architectural element. And if we're drawing grand architecture, then there are all sorts of architectural embellishments around them to really add interest to our subject. But in smaller scale architecture, individual houses or suburban streets, then casement windows can be very common, but they provide a lot of interest, both architecturally and visually. We take the trouble to observe it and to either draw it, or if the scale is such that we haven't got room to draw it all, to suggest it in some sort of way which will still create the effect of the way the windows are constructed. Hope this has been really helpful. I'll see you next time. Bye.